Barrie Swortz, welcome to Unitarian Anabaptist.
Tom, thank you so much for having me on the program.
Okay, so you are a very interesting guest. You happen to be a photographer that had the privilege in 1978 of being on the STURP team that investigated and handled the Shroud of Turin.
The first and only in-depth, non-destructive scientific examination of the Shroud of Turin in its entire history.
Wow, entire long history.
That's right.
So, yes. So, uh, you were. I wonder, first of all, if you could give us a little background of yourself. Like maybe you could tell us about your childhood a little bit, how you grew up, where you grew up,
Well, I
and
grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Go Steelers!
okay,
Um, you don't need to be a football fan to be a Steelers fan, just in case
okay,
people are wondering.
okay,
Um, and was raised in an Orthodox Jewish home.
uh huh,
Had a bar mitzvah and did all that, but I walked away from it the day after my bar mitzvah. I was finished. Um, no offense to anyone listening, but I have an aversion to organized religions. I have a gut feeling that the biggest problem with organized religion is they got organized.
okay, all right,
And so, I have sort of not disavowed, but I do not practice any particular faith, but I was raised to have a deep faith in God. So that never changed.
okay,
It's just the path that I take is a different path than others might take. But the way I see it, getting to God, whatever the path is that works for you, has got to be the right path if it gets you where you got to go.
yes, okay. So, your name Schwartz is rather interesting. It's not spelled typically as we would expect. Why
Well,
is that, Barrie?
it's Schwartz with an O instead of an A.
Uh huh.
And the story behind it is so typical of immigrants when they came to this country. My paternal grandfather was a tailor,
Okay.
and he owned a tailor shop. And at the other end of the block was another tailor, also named Schwartz. And they both spelled it with an A. And because they didn't get along, my grandfather changed it legally from an A to an O so that people would know the difference between that Schwartz and this Schwartz.
Okay. Interesting.
Go figure. Huh?
Okay. So there aren't too many Jews with the name Schwartz with an O. Is that safe
Well,
to say?
there are a few. I think there's a lady astronomer whose last name is Schwartz with an O. I
Okay.
don't know her. I don't know if there's any relation or not.
All right.
But there are a few, mostly from our family, my son, my grandkids, my brother, may he rest in peace, who died a couple of years ago. But so there aren't that many Schwartzes with an O. But
Okay.
it's interesting. It becomes a talking point,
Sure.
just like
Sure.
it did
Sure.
here.
Okay. And we had conversations before. You mentioned that you were inducted into the Army. How old
Navy,
were
Navy, Navy, Navy.
in the
No, I
Navy?
wasn't inducted. The Navy doesn't draft anybody.
Oh,
In 1965, I joined the Navy. That in itself is kind of an interesting story. I was doing fine and had a good job and working for a big department store. But I was going to get drafted. I was 1A. And in those days, if you weren't in college and deferred or medically deferred, you were in the Army or in the Marines.
oh,
And not
okay.
being a very large guy myself, I didn't see myself wearing a 70-pound pack on my back with a rifle. And so one night I was up late at night watching an old World War II Navy movie, black and white movie. And at the end of the movie, the ship sailed into the sunset and they played the Navy theme, Anchors Away. And the next day I went down and joined the Navy.
I see.
That was
Okay.
it.
Okay. Mainly to avert the other
Well,
consequence.
I served 4 years regular Navy, active duty.
Uh-huh.
Um, uh, it gave me the GI Bill, so I gave them 4 years. They gave me the GI Bill, which paid my way through Brooks Institute of Photography,
Ah,
which I otherwise could never have afforded on my own.
huh.
And so I gave them 4 years. They gave me a lifelong career. It was a fair enough trade.
Yes. Yes. And you were fortunate enough not to be in the heat of battle, too.
I was fortunately. I mean, I was I got kind of close to it in a way. I was stationed at the amphibious base in Coronado, San Diego, but I was in personnel administration. So I was there to take care of the service records of the UDT 11 and 12 and SEAL Team 1 and 2. So I
Oh,
was sending them back and forth to Subic Bay and to Da Nang.
oh,
But I didn't have to go, and I wound up going fishing with a guy who distributed my specialty. And I'd heard about a new base opening in Australia. And I told him, I said, look, why don't you send me to that base in Australia? And he said, well, first 2 years is going to be really busy, but I'm getting out in 2 years, I told him. He said, are you sure you want to do this? And I said, yep. So I got a week later, I got my orders to go to Australia and spent the last 2 years of my enlistment in Australia. Then I came back, got out of the Navy, went to Brooks Institute, which is also in California, got out in Long Beach, and started my career right there in Santa Barbara.
okay. So that would have been 1969?
69, exactly.
All right. So what happened between 1969 and 1978 to qualify you for
Well,
this exceptional task
one
that
of the things that qualified me, of course, was that I had a degree from Brooks Institute of Photography, which is technically, I think you could call it a trade school,
mm,
because they taught us from the guts of the technology. Everything was done with Kodak and densitometry, and I mean, it was done purely by the book. And
huh,
so I had a good underpinning of technology and technical expertise that was taught to me in the 3.5 years I was at Brooks.
okay.
And so I opened my photo studio in Santa Barbara in 1971. And one of the projects I got, it was in I think about 1975. There was a local company that was an imaging company, and they were contractors to Los Alamos National Laboratories.
Okay.
And so they contracted me because I had a darkroom and darkroom experience to work on a project for Los Alamos for 7 months. And of course, it had to do with above ground atomic explosions and mushroom clouds.
Huh.
And so I had to do things like superimposing a kilometer scale over a mushroom cloud accurately, and other information that was classified. And they had taken old motion picture films of these above ground explosions, and they processed them through their Cray computers, which they had at Los Alamos. And they were able to get new information from these old unclassified films. And so they needed a way of extracting that information, recording that information, and distributing it to the branches of the military and the Department of Energy, now called DOE, then called the Atomic Energy Commission. So for 7 months, I dealt with atomic bomb explosions. And at the end of that 7 month period, the gentleman I worked with, a man named Don Devan, we finished the project. So just a few weeks after that ended, Don Devan called me again. And he said, I thought, when the phone rings and you're in business, you're always praying it's the next job, right?
Yeah.
So I'm hoping, well, maybe this is the next job. And Don Devan said, well, not exactly. He said, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin? Now, Devan was an imaging scientist, and he was working at Los Alamos collecting those images from the Cray computer. In those days, there was no print screen button. You had to set up a camera in front of a screen and photograph it.
Oh, so is that what you were doing? Is that what you were doing?
I couldn't do that. I didn't have a high enough clearance to be in the room with it.
Okay.
So I gave him the camera, I gave him the film, I gave him the exposure and the filtration. He
Huh.
went and made the photographs, brought them back. I processed the film.
Oh,
If he got it right, we were able to use them. If not, he had to go back the following week and do it again. And it took
okay.
7 months, but we accomplished the project.
Oh, wow.
So after we finished that project and he called me again, I thought another maybe another project for Los Alamos. And he said, well, not exactly. He said, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin? And that's when I laughed. I said, but Don, I'm Jewish.
Yeah.
And Don laughed and said, so am I, remember? He was so I was invited onto the Shroud team by one of the other Jewish team members,
Okay.
which is ironic in its own right. But not completely when you think about it. That's a Jewish man on that cloth.
Right. Right.
So why shouldn't a couple of Jewish guys be involved in the study of that image, right?
That'd be my choice.
Yeah, well, apparently that was God's choice because
I
here I
think
am.
so. Yes, that's
Here
right.
I am 46 years later.
Yes. Yes.
So that's
Okay.
how I got on the team. And it was, like I say, it was kind of ironic that, but I said no when he first asked me to be involved.
Uh-huh.
Because he had been over at Los Alamos back and forth a bunch of times. He had met Jackson and Jumper, the co-founders of the STURP team. And
Oh.
because he was an imaging scientist, they immediately got Don involved in studying the image on the shroud. And that's why he was the one who called me, because when they decided that they would put a team together to perhaps get permission to study the shroud, they said, we need a photographer. Don Devan said, wait a minute, I just finished working with Schwortz over here, and he's qualified. And that's when he called me. But I said no at first because I didn't want to get involved in something I felt maybe I didn't have the right background for.
Huh.
He was the one who assured me, he said, look, this isn't about religion. This is about science and an image on a sheet of cloth.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that other people don't see this from a religious point of view, but our team is going there to examine the cloth and determine how that shroud image was formed. That's all.
Okay. So I'm trying to get this straight. So was Don the first person to recognize that the image on the Shroud of Turin had a three-dimensional quality to it?
No, but he was a participant when that occurred.
He was one of those who were collaborating on it.
Yeah. So what happened was this. They had photographs taken in 1931 by Giuseppe Enriet.
Okay.
And so there was an instrument over at Sandia Laboratories, which is a sister lab to Los Alamos. It's in Albuquerque.
Oh.
And it's also a weapons lab, just like Los Alamos is.
Okay.
And so the X-ray expert over at Sandia Labs had obtained an instrument called a VP8 image analyzer, vector processor 8-bit image processor.
Okay.
You input an image with a black and white video camera.
Uh-huh.
It displays the image on a green screen monitor, and it allows you to take the image and turn it up and down in 3D space based on the density of the image itself.
Oh.
So when you turn up the dial on the VP8, you get the natural relief of a human form.
Okay.
Now, that means, whoa.
Oh, I got lost here. Okay, I'm
There you
back.
go.
Okay.
That means that there's a correlation between the cloth and the body and the distance between the two when the image formed. Where the cloth and body came in direct contact, the image is darkest.
Oh.
As the distance, like where the hands raise it away from the torso,
Uh-huh.
as the distance increases, the image grows more faint till it gets to about 3.5 centimeters and it stops. So that encoded the topographical information of the man of the shroud into the density of the image on the cloth.
Gee. Okay, let's just backtrack a little bit. So the imaging devices, the green screen and this type of
VPA
stuff,
image analyzer.
VPA. Okay, these were developed to 3D image nuclear explosions?
No. This instrument was obtained by Bill Modern at Sandia Labs because he was an X-radiography expert. And he was looking for ways of extracting more data out of his X-rays that he was making of. He could never tell me what he was X-raying because it was all classified.
Oh, okay.
But my guess is perhaps a containment vessel for a nuclear weapon, perhaps.
Oh,
Something
okay.
like that. Maybe
Okay.
that's a guess.
Okay. It was just something related.
It was related to the weapons systems that he was working on.
Okay. Okay.
And so he felt that getting a VP8 image analyzer might help him get more information out of his x-rays. Well, nobody had ever put a normal photo in there to see what would happen, or especially a photo of the shroud. And when they put that in there, now look, any image that you put into a VP8, it will extract the lights and darks into vertical space.
Okay.
The only difference is with a normal photograph, it's a completely distorted jumble of shapes, makes no sense at all.
Okay. Yes.
The shroud image yields the natural relief of a human form. And that was the catalyst for those guys to say, you know what? We need to put a team together and see if we can get permission to examine this and figure out how this image got on this cloth.
So
That was the foundation of the STURP team.
do you have any idea why he experimented with the picture of the shroud?
Oh, because Jackson and Jumper and Don Devan, the guy who invited me, they were studying the shroud already, and they heard about Bill Modern having this instrument, so they called him up and said, "Hey, can we bring some photos over there and put them in your machine to see what comes out of it?"
Okay.
So it was just by accident. I don't know if it
Well,
was an accident. I wouldn't call it that.
but they probably had some inclination that if this was this image on the shroud is so unusual that it might yield something surprising.
Well, I think that, like any good scientist, you don't come up with an answer before you do the experiment.
Okay. All right.
You might come up with a hypothesis, but I don't think that they had any kind of foreknowledge of what was going to happen. That's why they went over to see what they would get.
Yeah.
And
So
that, when they saw that on the screen, and we have photographs of that on our website, when they saw that on the screen, they looked at each other and said, wait a minute, normal photographs don't do this. Normal artworks don't do this. How do we get the natural relief of a human form onto a piece of linen cloth? We should set up a team and investigate this.
okay.
And that was the catalyst for the STURP team.
Wow. Wow. That's okay. So I would guess that this type of imaging was pretty state of the art at the time.
In 1978. Oh, actually, this was 1976.
76. So that would have been pretty advanced,
Totally advanced.
totally advanced.
Not anywhere near what we do today, but
Yeah.
totally advanced.
So up till that time, there wouldn't have been anything so compelling.
Yeah, I mean, other than the fact that you can see the image on the shroud, and
Yes.
when it was first photographed in 1898, and the guy looked at his negative, he realized that what was on the cloth was a negative, and his negative was more like a positive with a more natural
Okay.
appearance.
I see.
And that in itself was unique, because if this thing is some medieval guy made it,
Yeah.
the concept of a photo negative didn't exist.
Right. Right.
So nobody would have thought to do this in medieval times. This must have occurred by some natural or perhaps supernatural event, but we weren't there to study supernatural events. We were
Okay.
there to determine what natural event might have occurred to create an image with these properties.
So how many pictures were taken of the shroud from the very first picture till the time that you in 1978?
Secundo Pio worked with a very large view camera and very large plates, glass plates.
That was the first
That was
picture.
the first photograph, 1898.
Okay.
In 1931 was the next time they allowed it to be photographed. Technology had advanced considerably. Instead of glass plates, I think they were more acetate negative type film,
Okay.
and that's what Giuseppe Henriet used when he made the photographs. And so in 78, I used 4x5-inch film and photographed half the shroud at a time with some overlap, so that 20 years later, when the technology evolved, I was able to take those two 4x5 transparencies, each of half the shroud, have them digitally scanned with a crossfield drum scanner, the best that existed, and in Photoshop put the two images together to create a single 400 megabyte file from which we make our life-size prints and replicas.
Okay. Like what is a life-size? Is it a life-size print? Is actually a photograph that you're selling that is the actual length of the shroud itself?
Correct. It's 14 and a half feet approximately by 3.5 feet. It's printed onto a cotton canvas material.
Oh,
It's printed in natural color, the same as if you were standing in front of the actual shroud.
okay.
We also make prints, but the prints, usually we only make half the shroud per print just because they're printed onto a plastic based material, and 14 and a half feet, you would damage it trying to handle it.
Okay, so the first the picture that's on a cloth, you say it's on a linen cloth. So how
Cotton canvas.
cotton canvas. So how close would this be to the real thing?
Frankly, you would get a better view of the shroud by looking at one of our replicas than if you were in Turin when the shroud is on display, because they only let you get about 10 feet away from it, and you're looking at it through several inches of bulletproof glass.
Oh, okay.
So people get our replicas, people can get right up to it, and they can see the details because the details are there. And so you actually can get a better, closer view of the shroud on our replica than if you went to Turin to see the actual shroud, because they don't let anybody get that close.
Okay. And it's behind glass, bulletproof glass. Wow.
Thick.
Wow. So in this 14-foot long replica that you have, what is the spatial distance between the top of the head from the front side to the back side?
About 7 inches.
Okay.
Now that you mention that, there happens to be a water stain that occurred most likely from the 1532 fire that caused all the burn holes on the shroud.
Uh-huh.
And some people mistake that water stain as the back side of the head, which would make the man of the shroud about a quarter of an inch thick. That's just a mistaken identity of identifying a water stain instead of the actual back of the head, which is about 6 or 7 inches distant from the front side of the head.
Okay, so that would have been a fold in the shroud?
Not a fold, a curve.
A curve. Okay.
This isn't the best example, but they laid him down with his head in the cloth, like that.
Okay. So, but
Is that more confusing or not?
Well, so what you're saying is there was a space between the back of his head and the cloth.
There's no imaging of the top of his head, and what that tells us is they left a little space that the cloth wasn't touching the top of his head. There was enough distance there for it not to be imaged in that 6 or 7 inches.
Okay. So I happened to listen to some of the Shroud podcast, Guy Powell's Shroud podcast.
I've been on Guys.
I know you have.
Yeah.
And I think it was there that he mentioned that there was this physicist who estimated that the energy okay. I probably shouldn't mention anything about that, huh?
No. Well, that physicist is Paolo de Lazzaro in Rome.
Okay.
Dear friend. Been to his house. Drank wine with him and with his family.
Okay.
Paolo de Lazzaro is a laser expert. And so what they did was they attenuated a laser, took a linen fiber and hit that fiber with the laser to discolor the surface. Now, they also damaged the primary cell wall, which they don't talk much about, because the image fibers on the shroud don't have a damaged primary cell wall.
Okay.
But But so he took that little thread and the amount of energy it required to
Oh,
discolor it and magnified that, multiplied that out scientifically to the rest
okay.
of the shroud, and they came up with 11 billion watts or whatever they came up with.
34,000 billion or something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Uh, the image was not made by a laser. Okay,
Right. Okay.
I can promise you that. So it's somewhat of a false comparison.
Okay. Okay. So there's really nothing, there's no way to explain by way of energy or, uh,
I don't believe it's a function of radiation or light. As a matter of fact, the STURP team, in their papers that were published in highly regarded peer-reviewed scientific journals, excluded light, radiation as potential imaging formation mechanisms.
okay. All right.
Because here's the thing: if light made the image, why do we only have the top surface of some fibers discolored and not between those fibers? Light would get in between, wouldn't it? Of course
Yeah.
it would.
Yes.
Light, we ruled that out right at the beginning. And I looked at it right away and knew it wasn't a photographically made image. Within the first 15 minutes, with my 10x magnifier, which we photographers always have one, I started looking at the image, looking for paint, particles, pigments,
Huh.
binders, the kind of things that one would expect to find on a painted cloth. Doesn't exist. I knew in the first 15 minutes that wasn't there. It wasn't until we completed our work, evaluated and published our data, that we could say to a scientific certainty it's not a painting.
Okay. Did you actually touch
I
the,
knew that within 15 minutes.
did you actually touch the cloth with your bare skin?
Yes, I did. Remember, in 1978, nobody knew squat about DNA.
Okay. Right. Right. So you left your DNA on the Shroud of Turin.
And I'm another long haired Jewish guy.
Wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
Like, when you actually touched the cloth, did you have any kind of like, no sensation? It was just a piece of cloth
No,
to you at
no.
the time.
Look, we were there for a completely different reason.
Yeah. Yeah. I know. But like,
And consequently, look, I'm not saying that some of the guys who might have been Christians or Catholics might have had more of an experience
uh-huh.
than I
Yeah.
did.
Yeah. Yeah.
But a lot of those guys, there were some atheists too.
Uh-huh.
So, look, if religion had been one of the factors,
Yes.
I wouldn't have been on that team, nor would have most of the other guys. They were
Okay.
hardcore scientists from Los Alamos.
Yeah.
When
Right.
people accuse them of being a bunch of religious
Oh, yeah.
fanatics, I say, you're crazy.
Yeah.
We're nuclear weapons guys.
It's hard. It's hard for me to imagine a bigger contrast than nuclear weapons scientists investigating the Shroud of Jesus. It
Just look at the laboratories represented on our team: Los Alamos National Lab, Sandia National Lab, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, the Air Force Weapons Laboratory, and Brooks Institute of Photography, of course, which I brought them on board because I was already on the faculty there as well. So the bottom line is, when people say, oh, well, they were just a bunch of religious fanatics, you might want to read an article that's in the latest issue of the British Society of the Turin Shroud newsletter. It's a subscription-only publication, unfortunately. But I wrote an article, and it's called "Enough!" exclamation point. I'm sick and tired of skeptics accusing our team of being religious fanatics, of being biased, of being mid-level scientists, of being, well, I mean, it goes
Yeah.
on and
Yeah.
on and on.
Yeah.
And they have the gall, some of these skeptics, to attack the guys who have died, who cannot even defend themselves. And it's one thing to challenge their conclusions, that's called science. But when you attack somebody personally
Yeah.
and demean them personally, get out of
Yeah.
my way, because here I come.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's my responsibility, since About 2/3 of the team have now died. To preserve their memory and their good memory and the good work that they did. And that's part of the reason Shroud.com exists, was to not only preserve their work, but to make it readily accessible to everybody. Because
Yes.
back in the 70s, the only way you could find and read a peer-reviewed journal was going to university research library. Nobody did that except researchers. So the public didn't have much access to what we did. Building Shroud.com enabled me to bring all that material onto the website. It's free. There's no advertising. We don't monetize our visitors. We don't use cookies. We don't use trackers. You remain anonymous on our website unless you choose to join our mailing list. And you don't even have to put your name down, just a valid email address. That's all we need. We're not making money on people visiting Shroud.com. We can make a lot
I
because we
imagine.
get a couple of million visits a year.
Couple million a year.
Yes. And so we could use that as a way of monetizing, but I personally would be offended to see advertising on that website. So as long as I'm alive and as long as my board of directors follows my lead, there will never be advertising on Shroud.com.
Thank you for that. Yes.
That's why I formed a nonprofit, because my pocket got empty after a while. After 14 years, I couldn't afford to keep it going. I had to form the nonprofit to get some support from outside because my business was slowing down. I was getting closer to retirement, and it was draining my meager resources to begin with.
Yes.
So the nonprofit was formed, and I legally transferred the ownership of the website, all my photography, everything, to the nonprofit legally. Got lawyers, did it the right way.
Wow.
So
Okay.
that way it can go on after I'm gone.
Okay. Well, that's so if you get millions of views per year,
Yeah.
do you have any idea where these people are like tuning in from? Do you have
I
any
stopped counting at 161 countries.
So people all over the world are curious,
Just as an
interested.
example, we just shipped material to Australia, Canada, Macau, which is part of mainland China.
Oh, wow.
Where else? Canada, Mexico, Australia, and Macau. Just this past week.
Huh.
Just this week.
Wow.
So yeah, we have visitors from all over the planet.
Now, as far as Christian, in the realm of Christianity, I'm guessing that Catholics are probably pretty interested in shroud stuff. Is that safe to say?
Historically, I would say of all the various denominations, they would be the number one interest in it.
Simply because they're interested in relics, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good chunk of the reason right there. Yeah.
So in the case of relics, like a Protestant would have a skeptic view of relics. Is that correct? Typically?
Yeah, historically.
Okay. So and relics, most relics are probably pretty difficult to prove that they have any significance or
Some are legit, I'm sure,
Mhm.
and others are questionable. And there's no easy way to verify that. And apparently, at least according to some historians, there was a tendency to manufacture relics in medieval times.
Mhm.
But the shroud isn't one of them.
So what can you say about there isn't another cloth, a face cloth that has some kind of matching quality to the Shroud of Turin?
It does, yeah. It's called the Sudarium of Oviedo. It's in Oviedo, Spain. I've seen it up close and personal. If you read in the Gospels, it was in the tomb with the big shroud, but folded and separate from the main shroud. And when I read that passage in the New Testament, I immediately realized that Jesus was given an authentic Jewish burial
Oh,
because That face cloth, just like we do today when somebody passes, we immediately cover their face.
Oh,
They would have done that with Jesus to bring him from the cross to the tomb, cover his head and face. It had his blood and pleural fluids from his lungs
oh,
soaked into the cloth. And Jewish law says anything with the decedent's blood on it must be buried with the body.
oh,
Muslims don't do that. Christians don't do that. There were no Christians in those days anyway. And so when I read that, I said, well, that's an authentic Jewish burial. To this day, that's still part of the Jewish tradition.
wow. Okay. So the history of both the cloth and the shroud, like they were separate as far as we've known, they've been separated for as long as the history can bear it out.
We know that the sudarium shows up in Spain somewhere in the 6th or 7th century.
Oh, it does.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
It's actually traceable further back than the shroud.
Okay. So
the
before
fact that they're both mentioned in the Gospels tells me, yeah, they were both there, and it makes sense that they would have preserved that face cloth. It has his blood on it, but they would have folded it and kept it separate because once they started cleaning the body, that would have been considered unclean.
Oh. So
it's a little more complicated than most people realize. We did Joe Marino called me up and he said, look, I'm going to write a paper and I'm going to list all the disciplines involved in the study of the shroud, disciplines and subdisciplines. And so I guessed at that moment in time on the phone, I said, God, there has to be at least 30 different disciplines. So Joe Marino did his research and in the end came up with 102 different disciplines and subdisciplines. That tells you how complex the subject of the shroud is, that goes through and requires so many different disciplines to study different aspects of it.
When you say discipline, you mean expertise in a field of study?
Correct. Science or history. Yep.
So there's 102 different angles to look at this.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that article's on Shroud.com.
Okay. All right.
Well, it's linked on Shroud.com.
Okay.
It's actually on academia. But we linked to several thousand articles on our site.
So I guess maybe we can just briefly touch upon, well, what do you think? Is this, you believe that the shroud is a genuine burial cloth that covered a crucified man, right?
I believe, and I'll say this in a way that I've been saying it a lot lately, you don't need to be a Christian to accept the peer-reviewed science based on direct physical examination of the cloth and to accept the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth, to accept that we have an artifact of that man whose influence is still being felt on this planet more so than when he was alive.
Yes.
Okay. So
Yes.
I don't have a problem accepting that. Whether or not he was the prophesied Messiah is a separate question.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
And our team didn't go there to determine if he was or wasn't the Messiah.
No.
We were there to determine if this image is some kind of painting, artwork, fake of some sort. And we've proven it's none of the above. And I don't use the word proven very lightly. Ray Rogers, the lead chemist on the STURP team from Los Alamos, used to call me up and yell at me if I used the word prove inappropriately. He would call me up and say, we don't have enough data to say that's proven. Change it. Okay, Ray. I changed it. So, to make a claim of something is proven scientifically requires a very high standard, more so than what we have in a courtroom even.
Okay.
Scientific standard is higher than that.
So from the cloth, you can determine that there was a fully dead, crucified human being under the cloth?
Scourged, speared in the side, and most importantly, crowned with a cap of thorns. Now, The Romans crucified a lot of people. I'm sure they speared a lot of people. I'm sure they even scourged a lot of people. Well, we only know of one occasion where they did all that and added the crown of thorns. Why? Because Jesus had proclaimed himself King of the Jews. Oh, you're the king, are you? Well, here's your crown, to humiliate him further.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yet we have bloodstains on this man's scalp from a crown of thorns. So it took me 17 years after we finished before the scientific evidence finally convinced me this has got to be the real thing.
Wow.
And it's not from a religious or theological point of view, but from a purely scientific point of view. The most plausible explanation is that they have preserved an artifact of the historical Jesus of Nazareth. My little Jewish mother, may she rest in peace,
Yes.
high school education, immigrant from Poland, heard one of my lectures. And we were driving back to her apartment and afterwards, and she was silent. And I always say that when a Jewish mother is silent, be afraid.
90 years old, right?
Not normal.
Was she not 90 years old at the time?
She was I think she was she was in her 80s then.
Okay.
She died just before her 92nd birthday.
Okay.
So we're driving back to her apartment, and she's silent. And so I'm going, oh boy, what's she going to say? So I finally turned to her. I said, okay, Mother, what do you think? And she looked at me, and we were in the car, and she said, of course, it's authentic. Now, it took me 17 years and all the peer-reviewed science in front of me before I drew that conclusion. And she hears one lecture, obviously from her son, but she immediately accepts it. And this is a Jewish woman. So I had to ask her, I said, Mother, what makes you say that? And that's when she got that tone of voice that mothers can get, kind of condescending a little bit, you know.
Uh-huh.
Barrie, they wouldn't have kept it for 2,000 years. If it had belonged to anyone else, it wouldn't have mattered. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized what a profound observation it is, because whoever rescued that piece of cloth out of the tomb put themselves at equal risk of being killed themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
So would you do that if it was the cloth that wrapped Joe Blow? Probably not.
No.
It had to be somebody of such importance that it was worth the risk. And my little Jewish mother immediately grasped that. And it took me, after she said that to me, some time of thinking about it before I realized that that was a very profound observation.
Yes.
Why would somebody preserve something like that in the first place? Unless it belonged to someone of such great importance that it was worth the risk.
Was the Shroud of Turin likely kept in Constantinople before it wound up?
Well, you know, look, the history of the Shroud is obscure in areas. Some people believe so, others disagree. It's like anything else in science and history. There's always somebody that says yes and somebody that says no. I'm not sure that we'll ever know completely, but I can say this, is that some testing that's been recently done I just saw the results earlier today, actually. Excuse me. It was an isotope study done on some fibers, and it tells where the flax was grown for that fiber. Hasn't been published in a peer-reviewed journal yet, but I did see the preliminary version of the paper earlier today, and we believe that this was woven somewhere in the Mideast. Now, they didn't really make this kind of cloth in Jerusalem, but you don't have to go that far to Syria where they did make this kind of cloth. So my personal belief is it came from Syria on the back of a camel in a caravan, and it was an expensive piece of cloth. But look in the Gospels, it says it was provided by Joseph of Arimathea. They don't tell us much about him except one thing: he was a wealthy man. And
Right.
he had his own tomb already.
Yeah.
So if you have a tomb, you're going to have a shroud.
Oh, so it would have been what was perhaps intended for him.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And here's the other thing: people say, well, it says in the Gospels they went out and bought it. Well, it was Friday afternoon. The Jewish shops would have been closed to prepare for the Sabbath. It would have been very difficult for him to find a shop open that could buy something like this. It makes more sense that he already had it.
Yeah, yes,
He
it
did
does.
buy it at some point,
Yes.
but not that day. And there's people who dispute that too. It's the shroud. There's always going to be some dispute.
Okay. Wow.